The Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Development will come to order. I note there's a quorum present. Without objections, the chair is recognized to call a recess at any time. Today's hearing addresses the growing threat of foreign influence in American education. The father of this nation, George Washington, was acutely aware of this threat and offered sage advice to future generations upon leaving office. In his farewell address, Washington warned, history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. In the year 2023, Washington would look upon the foreign entanglements with disfavor and disappointment. China and other foreign adversaries are determined to undermine America's national interests and infect our political discourse. The modern battleground now includes college universities, campuses, and our students' young minds. In April, I took to the floor to condemn the foreign influence in our post-secondary academic institutions. I said then what I will repeat today: the manipulation of our children on American soil, paid for by American taxpayer, is unacceptable. For those who facilitate and undermine our institutions is traitorous. We're now in an era where too many American college and university administrators, due to financial incentives or bribes from adversarial regimes, choose to allow indoctrination on our American campuses. I call it profit over patriotism. Adversaries, monarchs, theocracies, dictatorships, and anti-American Chinese Communist Party pay for influence in our universities through foreign gifts and funding. It is the height of disloyalty. If the Biden administration will do nothing about it, we have a Republican Party in conference. I promise we will. Under Section 117, the Higher Education Act, colleges and universities must, and must is not an option, must disclose any foreign funding to their institutions exceeding $225,000. Yet in 2019, the Senate report found 70% of colleges choose to skirt, hide, and cheat so as not to be compliant with this law. We're now at a time when only 30% of college administrations overseeing our educational institutions deem it important to follow law put in place by the Congress with oversight authority. To make matters worse, the Trump administration found $6.5 billion in previously undisclosed foreign funds. Once again, profit over patriotism, profit over love of country, and profit over love of freedom. Our adversaries and America's enemies, some guilty of some of the absolute worst human rights abuses, do not pay billions of dollars to educational institutions because of some pie-in-the-sky wish of humanitarian goodness. No, these dollars come with strings attached, which are then used to leverage against American faculty and students. Meanwhile, the American taxpayer is left supporting institutions that sacrifice our national values, our freedom, and our future for money. For example, foreign funds are used to set up state-backed cultural exchange centers that operate as cultural indoctrination centers. China, for instance, donates money to American universities to fund Confucius institutions, renowned campus hubs known for pushing propaganda like the denial of the Tiananmen Square massacre. These institutions also monitor and threaten Chinese international students here in the United States if they speak out against the CCP. Political pressure has caused many of these institutions to close on paper, but in reality, they simply evolve and rebrand under a different name. These problematic relationships still pose a direct threat to students and academic freedom. Moreover, the foreign funding creates inroads for intellectual property theft. In this arena, again, China poses a serious threat. Around 80% of economic espionage crimes prosecuted by the Department of Justice are committed by communist Chinese actors. The theft of trade secrets costs Americans an estimated $600 billion annually. How many of these American universities are inadvertently sponsoring CCP-backed espionage? There are 70% of college administrators who are non-compliant, opting not to be transparent to congressional oversight. Far too long, educational institutions have reaped financial benefits while our enemies have undermined our culture. Ultimately, too many of these college administrators feel they're above the accountability and oversight. What else can we conclude other than there's a systemic sense of arrogance within these institutions? Once again, $6.5 billion funneled in secrecy, undisclosed foreign funds to 70% of American institutions of learning. For a regime that is anti-capitalist, the CCP seems to have found a remarkable return on investment in our taxpayer-funded colleges and universities. It's time we take these foreign threats seriously, beginning with foreign influence on America's campuses. We should disentangle from China, as Washington would have preferred, but this requires a serious executive. The Biden administration doesn't seem to get it. Recently, Secretary Janet Yellen called decoupling from China a big mistake. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan echoed her a week later. Biden's feckless Department of Education has yet to open not one single Section 117 investigation. The department talks on both sides of its mouth on this particular issue. The department blames Congress, saying that they are overwhelmed and lack funding. And yet the DOE transferred this authority to investigate these violations from a well-equipped Office of General Counsel to an underwater FSA. The FSA is ill-suited for enforcement is so ill-suited for enforcement that online portals to report these violations were broken for months with no communication. We also have no indication the department is conducting substantial reviews of any submitted disclosures. For those who are curious, what is the FSA? The Federal Student Aid. What does the student loans have to do with the CCP infiltrating, bribing our institutions, and stealing our intellectual properties? Absolutely nothing. It's a total sham that the Department of Education thinks they can get away with this, and I think it's pure arrogance. Rather than enforce the law, President Biden has cozied up with Beijing. Thanks to the congressional oversight, we now know that the Penn Biden Center received tens of millions of dollars in anonymous Chinese funding and then paid the future president a handsome salary of $900,000. Moreover, we know that the Penn Biden Center employed 10 future senior administrative officials with salaries up to $208,000. Does this have anything to do with the administration's unwillingness to enforce Section 117? We're waiting to see how that works out. It appears that the Biden administration has purposely chosen to turn a blind eye. I can promise you this committee, with a Republican majority, will not. Freedom can only survive with transparency. The next reporting deadline for Section 117 disclosures is at the end of this month. This administration has just under 20 days to ensure that the America's colleges and universities, taxpayer-funded institutions, are not hiding foreign donations from public eye. For the sake of our republic and the millions of taxpaying Americans, we look for full transparency from these institutions. With that, I yield to the ranking member for her opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Owens, and good morning. I want to express my gratitude to our witnesses for their testimonies this morning. I would also like to acknowledge Dr. Moss, my former educational advisor, and all of the students in attendance for today's hearing. Your dedication to promoting inclusivity and innovation in our education system inspires all of the members of this committee. So welcome. It is so important that this committee recognizes that we are here to serve you and to address your needs. We are the Education Committee. Global collaborations and federal research investments are vital for the investment of our society. Through collaboration with global partners and strategic federal investments in research, universities across the world have made bold, forward-thinking strides in health, science, and technology. The benefits of global partnerships undoubtedly help drive intellectual and campus diversity while bolstering our economy. However, as the federal government provides roughly $30 billion annually to colleges and universities to support research and development efforts, we must ensure that colleges and universities are transparent about their ties to foreign entities. Section 117 of the Higher Education Act requires the Department of Education to collect and publicly disclose certain information about foreign gifts and contracts involving institutions of higher education. This crucial process aims to promote public transparency regarding the role of foreign funding on higher education and safeguard government-funded activities against undue foreign influence. Unfortunately, I fear that my Republican colleagues have overemphasized enforcement rather than providing guidance regarding Section 117. The lack of clear guidance hinders institutions' ability to comply with the law effectively. We should focus on streamlining the oversight mechanisms in place to ensure Section 117 compliance. It should provide clear guidance for institutions to engage in international collaboration. Finally, it would be so careless if we did not remind my Republican colleagues that asking for accountability and compliance in this hearing can occur without scapegoating our Asian American community. When discussing foreign influence on campus, it is imperative that we do not fuel prevailing anti-Asian sentiments. Congress and this administration have raised valid concerns regarding the Chinese Communist Party and their agenda against the United States. These worries should not be twisted into an excuse to push anti-Asian rhetoric, and we must safeguard our interests without adopting an extreme isolationist position. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, all members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m., 14 days after the date of this hearing, which is July 27th, 2023. And without objection, the hearing records will remain open 14 days to allow such statements and other materials referenced during this hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I now turn to the introduction of our three distinguished witnesses. First witness is Mr. Paul Moore, who is a senior counsel for the Defense of Freedom Institute, which is located here in Washington, D.C. Our second witness is John C. Yang, who is President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, which is also located here in Washington, D.C. And our final witness is Greg Singleton, who is the China Program Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, which again is here in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for you guys being here. We want to thank the witnesses for being here today and look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to committee rules, I would ask that you each limit your oral presentation to 5-minute summary of your written statement. I would also like to remind the witnesses to be aware of their responsibilities to provide accurate information to the subcommittee. I want to first recognize Mr. Moore.
Good morning, Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the committee. My name is Paul Moore. I'm Senior Counsel of the Defense of Freedom Institute for Policy Studies, and I previously served as Chief Investigative Counsel for the U.S. Department of Education and as an Assistant U.S. Attorney and in other roles at the Department of Justice. As Chief Investigative Counsel, much of my role involved investigating compliance by America's colleges and universities with Section 117, the statutory requirement that America's colleges and universities timely report qualifying foreign gifts and contracts to the department. Section 117 reporting requirements are not complicated or burdensome. They merely require that universities accurately and timely report those foreign gifts and contracts valued at $250,000 or more to the department twice a year. Unfortunately, the department's enforcement efforts have historically been very uneven. For example, in 2004, the department began permitting institutions to provide donor anonymity when reporting foreign gifts and contracts. This practice, called anonymizing, directly undermined congressional intent that foreign donor identities be revealed. This led to a dramatic increase in the flow of foreign money to higher education beginning around 2009, particularly from China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other countries. Many of our great universities have since become addicted to that foreign money. In April 2011, the FBI issued a white paper warning that foreign adversaries seek to take advantage of America's higher education research enterprise to gain military and economic advantages over the United States. In February 2019, the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations issued a bipartisan report warning that foreign government spending at U.S. schools is effectively a black hole because up to 70% of all colleges and universities were failing to report foreign gifts and contracts. This began to change in November of 2019 when, at the direction of Secretary Betsy DeVos, the Department's Office of the General Counsel initiated multiple civil investigations of noncompliance by some of America's leading universities. The Department found that Section 117 reporting had been generally under-inclusive and inaccurate, and found that many colleges and universities even appeared to conceal foreign funding. These compliance failures occurred despite those same colleges and universities having extremely sophisticated foreign financial tracking capabilities. In October 2020, the department published a report revealing that its enforcement efforts had resulted in disclosure of more than $6.5 billion in previously undisclosed foreign gifts and contracts. The report revealed that historically fewer than 300 of the approximately 6,000 U.S. higher educational institutions actually self-report foreign money each year as required by Section 117. The department found that foreign adversaries are likely targeting specific institutions for their research and development technologies. In April 2021 testimony before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, FBI Director Wray warned that China presents a severe threat to our academic institutions. Despite these clear threats and warnings, the Biden administration's Section 117 enforcement efforts have taken a very different direction. The department now appears to have largely ceded control over its Section 117 enforcement policies to a higher education industry group known as the American Council on Education, or ACE, which has long objected to nearly any serious efforts by the department to enforce Section 117. This puts America's national security at risk. Since January 2021, reporting of foreign gifts and contracts by universities has declined dramatically, even as the threat to America has increased. In August 2022, ACE's senior vice president announced the department's closure of its remaining Section 117 investigations and that Section 117 management would be transferred back to federal student aid. Normally, such a significant announcement should have come from the department, not higher education's chief lobbyist. FSA is unsuited to the Section 117 enforcement task, which may explain why the department has chosen to shift Section 117 enforcement responsibilities to FSA. Section 117 is a very simple, straightforward statutory disclosure requirement that the department is required to enforce. To do so, it should immediately return enforcement responsibilities to the Office of the General Counsel. Congress should ban the practice of anonymizing donors in Section 117 disclosures. Congress should tie Section 117 compliance by America's colleges and universities with their eligibility to participate in Title IV federal student loan, grant, and work-study programs. And Congress may wish to require that prominent college and university administrators certify under oath the accuracy and completeness of their Section 117 disclosures to the department. The American people generously fund significant portions of the operations of most of our colleges and universities and deserve earnest enforcement efforts by the department. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. I'd like to next recognize Mr. Yang.
Thank you, Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Wilson, and the other members of this committee. My name is John C. Yang. I'm the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, based in Washington, D.C. Also previously served in the Department of Commerce, as well as Shanghai-based Legal Director for the American Company of Illinois Tool Works. Look, the American university system is the envy of the world, and the United States has benefited from the talent that has come to the United States. Many of the most significant scientific advances have come from immigrants, such as Enrico Fermi and such as Albert Einstein. Let's also remember that many of the scientists and students that we are talking about today chose to come here because of the democratic ideals that we represent and because they prefer our system of government rather than a communist and autocratic system. We should be embracing that community, learning from this community, and celebrating that they chose to be here and to contribute to our American democracy. Unfortunately, xenophobic and anti-immigrant and racist rhetoric used by policymakers and officials at the highest level of our government fueled resurgent xenophobia against immigrants, especially of Chinese and Asian descent. One need not look further than the recent attacks against Congresswoman Judy Chu, whose loyalty to the United States was questioned simply because of her race and ethnicity. Public and government officials must be cautious in engaging in anti-Chinese rhetoric and must challenge colleagues and peers who do so. The cost to the Asian American community is clear. Surveys by the Pew and the Asian American Foundation demonstrate that 1 in 2 Asian Americans no longer feel safe because of their race and ethnicity. And shockingly, 1 in 4 Americans believe that Asian Americans are somehow more loyal to their country ethnicity rather than the United States. That narrative has to change. There's currently a widespread suspicion of scientists, university researchers, and students who are Chinese or of Asian descent. Then President Trump in 2018 wildly and irresponsibly stated that, quote, almost every student that comes over to this country from China is a spy. As another example, the now abandoned China initiative created a mandate and increased pressure on the FBI to scrutinize and target Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in the research community, based seemingly only on their ethnicity rather than criminal activity. Indeed, FBI Director Wray suggested that there should be a case open in every single U.S. attorney's district on the China initiative. This led to the prosecution of many Asian Americans and immigrants for conduct that is minor, unrelated to espionage, and typically would not support criminal prosecution. Several cases over the last 2 years demonstrate that this approach was flawed, leading to dismissals and acquittals in cases like Geng Chen, An Minghu, and Franklin Tao. Fortunately, the administration looked at this initiative, recognized that it was wrong-headed, and decided to abandon that approach. These entanglements and investigations have led to the dismissal, resignation, and termination of Asian American scientists, as well as a growing fear among Asian Americans and Asian immigrants of being targeted and scapegoated based on their race, ethnicity, and national origin. Look, to be clear, we do have legitimate differences with the Chinese government, and the Xi Jinping regime presents a unique national security challenge. But if we are not careful and we do not use the proper language and engage in the proper nuance about these policies and actions, there are communities that will suffer. And I am not theorizing about this here. We saw the incarceration of Americans of Japanese descent based on fictionalized evidence of espionage. We saw the murder of Sikh Americans and hate crimes against the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian American community after 9/11. And we saw the murder of Vincent Chin because of a trade war with Japan that we had in the early 1980s. Look, these are legitimate disputes that we had with these foreign nations. And in each of these cases, our domestic community, our Americans, suffered. When approaching these issues, we need to use a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. We need to approach these issues with facts, precision, and expertise so that we can be effective and efficient with our solutions. We need to define our terms carefully to avoid overreach and to allow universities, professors, and students to understand their obligations and to comply. And we need to train investigators to avoid misunderstandings, stereotypings, and overreach. Universities have been perfect places to facilitate effective, long-standing, meaningful intellectual exchanges. Those exchanges bring so many different benefits that are critical to helping individuals understand each other, their culture, and their shared humanity. Open research and collaboration is critical to addressing some of our world's most difficult problems, such as climate change and technology. I ask that all of us avoid jingoism to avoid stereotyping. Let's engage in a thoughtful, specific discussions necessary to celebrate the strength of the American education system while recognizing the challenges that we face. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. I'd like to recognize Mr. Singleton.
Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Wilson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about foreign adversary influence on U.S. college campuses. I'm pleased to provide relevant research and policy insights from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a nonpartisan research institute where I serve as a senior fellow. Foreign adversary nations are engaged in far-reaching campaigns to exploit the United States' open, collaborative nature in furtherance of their strategic military and economic goals. Nowhere is this threat more acute than on U.S. college campuses today. These complicated challenges extend well beyond technology transfer and intellectual property theft. Increasingly, America's adversaries, but particularly China, are leveraging their almost unfettered access to U.S. universities to stifle free speech protections, monitor student activities, and promote false narratives. No doubt, openness, freedom, and diversity represent fundamental pillars of our democracy and serve as intrinsic strengths on the United States and our way of life. Maintaining America's competitive edge hinges on a commitment to open academic and scientific exchange. But so too must we embrace common sense measures to protect our intellectual capital and discourage its misappropriation, as well as to counter authoritarian attempts to promote on-campus censorship and intimidation. In doing so, we must take serious steps to avoid inflaming anti-Asian rhetoric or the unjust labeling of Chinese students as spies. Indeed, by encouraging dialogue and respectful engagement, Congress stands to promote a clear-eyed understanding of the complex geopolitical issues at play while still respecting diverse perspectives. Responding to this evolving threat requires the establishment of new legislative and regulatory guardrails centered around enhanced transparency requirements, mandatory due diligence and vetting protocols, and in some cases, funding and gift prohibitions to protect academic freedom and integrity. Some of those measures should include a federal ban on Confucius Institutes and their rebranded successors, which are proliferating across college campuses, lowering Section 117's foreign gift reporting threshold from $250,000 to $5,000, and empowering the U.S. Department of Education to better investigate and enforce Section 117 noncompliance. Mandating that U.S. universities make publicly available details regarding all academic and research partnership agreements, both active and inactive, with entities located in countries of concern, such as China. And establishing formal mechanisms for the Department of Education in coordination with other agencies to share relevant insight, best practices, and trends with select foreign partners, similarly working to confront malign adversarial influence throughout their higher education systems. We should not view these new measures as limitations on academic freedom, but rather as necessary safeguards to preserve the integrity of our higher education system. Transparency and oversight do not stifle collaboration, but instead ensure that partnerships are built on a foundation of trust, accountability, and shared values. Moreover, in better scrutinizing financial ties, legislators can prevent undue influence and ensure that research and educational activities remain independent and free from adversarial pressure. On these issues, policymakers here in Washington stand to learn from leaders at the state level, including in places like Florida. This year, Democrats and Republicans in Tallahassee, working closely with university representatives and higher education stakeholders, unanimously passed first-of-its-kind legislation, enhancing transparency requirements, foreign influence disclosure rules, and targeted gift bans to protect the state's post-secondary institutions and their students from the evolving threat posed by adversarial countries of concern. These and other state-level initiatives can and should serve as models for federal-level legislation. No doubt, efforts to neutralize the threat facing by China, Russia, and other adversarial nations transcends political lines, even as they present myriad cross-jurisdictional challenges in Congress. Legislators must therefore work together to leverage their diverse backgrounds and experiences across congressional committees to effectively tackle this issue and produce lasting legislative outcomes. On behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I thank you again for inviting me to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Singleton. Appreciate that. Where are we? Okay. Under Committee Rule Number 9, we'll now question the witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I will begin the process. Mr. Moore, one excuse we hear from schools that's tracking foreign funds they receive is too difficult. Given how well universities seem to track athletic booster contributions or which students with outstanding tuition and fees are due, we find that response somewhat hard to believe. During your investigation, did you find out it was truly difficult for schools to identify and track the foreign contributions?
Mr. Chairman, our investigations found that the universities had the information we wanted readily at hand, but they were extremely reluctant to provide it to us. And so the idea that it presented an additional burden to them, they were already, our investigations revealed that they were already very systematically tracking foreign contracts, foreign gifts, and of course pursuing donors around the world with great vigor, as you might expect. And so it wasn't an issue where the universities would have had to have set up new mechanisms. They could simply have made an effort to tap the information that they were already collecting and producing and provide that accurately to the department as required by Section 117.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to ask both of you and Mr. Singleton this question. I think you kind of addressed it somewhat in your opening statement, but I want to just make sure we highlight this. We're engaged with a battle against foreign bad actors whose goals are to undermine our American culture of freedom, turn our students against the free market system, and steal our intellectual properties. But there are also domestic actors in our educational system willing to grant these foreign actors safe harbor on our college campuses. What suggestions, I think you highlighted some of these things before, would you say that to hold these domestic actors accountable when the Department of Education refuses to take action?
Well, I think that the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education ought to be very cognizant of pressure from the Chinese Communist Party that's applied in the United States to students, particularly of Chinese descent. That's a big issue and an ongoing issue. It's been an issue at Fordham and other universities. And frankly, the university, the department ought to be extremely aware and ought to have a way to facilitate investigations of that sort of pressure from entities acting on behalf of the CCP.
Okay. Ms. Siegel, do you have any suggestions on that also?
Sure. I mean, collaboration is vital, but China has proven adept at exploiting America's academic openness and dynamism to advance its intertwined industrial policies and military expansion. Passing legislation to prevent potential conflicts of interest on campus is essential. Heightened student screening and in some cases outright denials for individuals from certain state-run institutions in China's military, but in particular holding hearings like this, but establishing a federal government office that American state and local governments and non-governmental organizations can approach for advice on how to best manage some of these requests and how to manage and learn from the experiences of other universities across the country.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Singleton, now, one of the loopholes we've seen abused is a 501c3 system to circumvent their foreign reporting rules. Foreign regimes can prop up nonprofits, use them to funnel money to college campuses. On the other side, colleges will sometimes receive foreign donations through an affiliated university foundation and then not report these contributions. Can these loopholes be addressed?
Absolutely. I mean, nonprofits and murky corporate donations are a big threat. So are gifts and donations from state-backed or state-owned companies and state-owned enterprises in China, not to mention individuals acting as cutouts for authoritarian regimes. So the current law only requires disclosure if the donor is a foreign government. And this is a loophole that invites authoritarian governments to make gifts through third parties. And the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, uses third-party intermediaries for these types of operations, including espionage efforts. It's widely documented. It's a staple of their political and economic force abroad. Increased transparency is the answer.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm going to now recognize the ranking member for purpose of questioning witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question is for you, Mr. Yang. In 1960, America's federal funding represented 45% of all global research and development funding across the world. Today, that funding is only 10% for global funding. Why is federal funding of research important, and what can the federal government do to continue supporting that research?
Thank you very much for that question. Federal funding is critical to advance in all of the fields that we're talking about. And let's be clear, the vast majority of the funding goes to open research. Open research leads to the discoveries that we see, whether it is in science, whether it is mathematics, whether it is even in literature or history. And so if we are trying to really advance the American system, we need to continue that open and collaborative process. And I agree that transparency is necessary, but we need to make sure that that transparency is narrowly tailored to the issues at hand. Make sure that our universities are able to comply in a simple manner. The other thing I am concerned about is, as we are moving along in this, if we are going to be changing standards, we need to make sure not to have retroactive application of those standards so that universities or individuals get caught up in the process.
Thank you. Can you discuss the economic and social value of bringing in scholars from across the globe into the American higher education system?
Thank you very much. Certainly, there's a huge economic value in the neighborhood of tens of billions of dollars that goes into our U.S. economy from international students as a whole. But then beyond that is the soft value that we have of introducing them to our American system. And I would challenge and I would posit that our universities are still succeeding in that. Frankly, if anything, the numbers tell us that the sentiment against Asian Americans, Chinese Americans is at an all-time low. So to the extent that propaganda is trying to cause American students to look against the United States or look towards China, that propaganda is failing. The fact that 1 in 4 Americans believe that Asian Americans owe a dual loyalty is very problematic. And so we must continue to encourage those cultural exchanges so that the next generation beyond us can find ways to find the common humanity in all of us.
And can you tell us what impact does harmful rhetoric and misinformation have on collaborations with international educational institutions?
Literally, my organization and sister organizations of ours hear almost every day about professors and students that are no longer willing to come to the United States. And these are professors and students that have so much to offer to our country. And again, I'm not even necessarily talking about sensitive areas like nuclear secrets or military industrial complex issues, but basic collaboration that is being lost. And they are going to other countries. So if we are talking about a potential brain drain to this country, that is something that we have to solve as well.
Thank you. Mr. Moore, in my home state of Florida, the University of Florida's agroecology program partners with several international schools, including the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. These research partnerships are crucial to promoting mutually beneficial research in our higher education institutions, but the calls in your testimony to increase enforcement of Section 117 has the potential to foster a hostile environment for future international research. Can you please explain to this committee how this draconian enforcement measures will not discourage collaboration with international research partners?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think Section 117 and anything that I've mentioned today to strengthen it it's simply, again, disclosure. It wouldn't do anything to inhibit money from China, money from Israel, money from anywhere. Those relationships can continue, contracts can continue, new ones can be made, billions of dollars can continue to come in. There's no limitation on that in anything that I've said or anything that Section 117 currently says. It simply has to be disclosed. And my view is that the American people are entitled to that information. Policymakers should be informed by that information too. That shouldn't be any kind of threat to collaborations. If there's a nefarious donor or collaborator and it scares off that collaboration, then I think that's probably a very good thing. In the case that you mentioned, I don't think that would be an issue. Thank you.
I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Cano.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I just would like to begin with a bit of pushback on some of your opening comments. With regards to the statements you made about Biden and he just doesn't get it. We've heard that you all believe that the Department of Education is lax in its enforcement of Section 117. In reality, though it is that the department's most recent data contains tens of thousands of entries from hundreds of colleges and universities, and it seems to me that the department is communicating with colleges and universities about how important it is to report any grants and contracts from foreign sources. In addition, colleges and universities have gotten the message that they are making great strides in reporting this information in accordance with the law. While the prior administration was focused on a few bad actors, this administration is providing guidance and support to colleges and universities to help ensure compliance with the law, which is what everyone wants. Mr. Moore, you said in your testimony, you cited a bipartisan Senate report that 70% of all colleges in the U.S. of all U.S. colleges and universities fail to report. Do you still believe that to be true?
Congressman, that was according to the report from that we.
Okay, so you just are repeating a report that was issued in 2017?
That was in 2020.
2020.
October of 2020. I don't know what the current figures are. I don't have access to those figures.
So in fact, that number could be misleading. It could be out. It could not be accurate. But it might not be accurate right now.
I cited the date in my testimony, but it may have changed. Absolutely.
So it could be changed. And that 70%, is that just in reference to reporting on grants and contributions from China, or might other authoritarian nations also be part of a concern of ours?
Many, Congressman, you're right to mention that, and I mentioned in my testimony Russia, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. There are many nations. This isn't an Asian-focused or China-focused concern. This is all the world.
Might it be productive for us to have a hearing not just on China, but on the influence of all malign potential nations out there that are authoritarian and have might have an interest in influencing our universities?
I think that's a wonderful idea, Congressman.
Great. Mr. Singleton, is this third-party entity loophole only a problem for China, or do other nations potentially contribute or find ways to get money to universities through these mechanisms of third-party loophole through third parties?
Sure. I mean, friends and foes alike take advantage of those sorts of loopholes, which is why we should apply the standard evenly across any country.
I'm curious about this sole focus on China of this hearing when we have other authoritarian nations that pose these issues. And mind you, I'm concerned about China's authoritarianism, but I'm also concerned about authoritarianism in general. I'm going to suspect that it has something to do with how the previous administration dealt with China, and I think a very clumsy way. Mr. Chairman, I would seek unanimous consent to enter the record a political article entitled 15 Times Trump Praised China as Coronavirus Was Spreading Across the Globe. And just to give you a flavor, there's 15 entries here from January 22nd through February when the virus was clearly posing a problem, but underappreciated by the president then. He says, one of the great many things about our just signed giant trade deal with China is that it will bring both USA and China closer together in so many ways. Terrific working with President Xi, a man who truly loves his country, and more to come. January 24th, China has been working very hard to contain the virus. The United States greatly appreciates their efforts and transparency. It will all work out well. Goes on and on and on. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter this into the record.
No objection.
Several months later, when it wasn't going so well in the United States to manage it, he started saying things like Kung flu, the China virus, with tremendous boomerang effects on Asian Americans, because as an Asian American, I know what it feels like when one of the Asian ethnicities is singled out for scapegoating. And then there's a generalized hatred that spreads throughout all Asian Americans. So, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to make that point. I yield back.
Thank you so much. I just want to make sure we also clarify that this hearing is really about the infiltration of bad actors into our college systems, and also the transparency for funding of that. So China has to be one of them, but there are others, and we're going to make sure we address them all. I'd like to have Mr. Good introduce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first couple of questions will be for Mr. Moore here. Mr. Moore, the University of Pennsylvania, you know where this is going, which runs the Penn Biden Center in Washington, D.C., reportedly received $14 million from unnamed contributors in China and Hong Kong, and $2.4 million from unnamed contributors in Saudi Arabia. There's another country, Saudi Arabia, since 2021. The names of these donors are concealed by the Department of Education, which is required to report donations to universities that it funds with federal dollars. But the agency has reportedly declined a request to provide the names. Mr. Moore, according to these reports, again with the Biden Center having received millions of dollars from unnamed foreign influence, should the American public be concerned about that?
Thank you, Congressman. I think the American public should be very concerned about the undisclosed donor identities to UPenn, particularly leading up to the presidential election in 2020. It was after the establishment of the Biden Center that there was a very dramatic increase. I think reportable Gibson contracts were up 389% between 2018 and 19. Meanwhile, I think 9 current administration officials were on the payroll of the UPenn Biden Center. UPenn this goes, in my opinion, to the question of requiring that donor identities be made available as part of disclosure. Disclosure is somewhat meaningless if the donor identities aren't provided, so the American people and policymakers can know who's giving what to whom. And UPenn is not alone. There are many other universities with similar patterns where it appears that there's an attempt to influence policymakers, but this was a rather startling one with UPenn, and that's why I think that donor identities should be disclosed.
Yeah, and just one of the offices where classified documents have been found that belong to Mr. Biden, by the way. Mr. Singleton, the reports are that $6.5 billion in previously unreported foreign money has went to universities from adversarial countries, $6.5 billion. $8.4 billion in anonymously reported foreign money over the last decade. $800 billion is the total endowment of these, of the market value of the endowment of United States institutions of higher learning, by the way. $807 billion is the endowment, and yet we've got $1.6 trillion in outstanding student loans with exorbitant increase in college tuition. In your testimony, you mentioned how university endowments are increasingly under foreign influence. Could you speak to that a little more, elaborate on that, please?
Absolutely. Currently, there are no restrictions whatsoever on U.S. university endowments from investing in Chinese companies that are directly involved in Chinese military civil fusion. There are numerous examples of endowment funds being injected and capitalized into Chinese companies that are directly involved in developing advanced technologies that are used to propagate the Uyghur genocide, for example. And there's very little insight and accountability into how these endowment funds are being managed, what's their exposure to China, and certainly what linkages and dependencies are created as a result of those endowment relationships that do create undue burdens and adversarial pressure, not just on the endowment funds themselves, but the universities.
Why do you think that universities with the largest endowments tend to be the worst offenders with complying with Section 117, the reporting of foreign donations?
Well, I would say that, the key, right, is updating and expanding mandatory reporting requirements because it will simply conform with the realities that foreign influence plays on the university system, including endowments. Universities run the risk of entanglement with the Chinese Communist Party in large part because they rely on these opaque funding and endowment systems from party-connected sources. That includes gifts, donations, investments, Confucius Institutes, and research partnerships.
Staying with you, Mr. Singleton, in one of his first national security-related acts, President Biden, a year and a half ago, withdrew, or 2.5 years ago, I should say, withdrew a Trump-era rule requiring universities to disclose their terms of agreement with Confucius Institutes, which, of course, act as Chinese Communist Party outposts on college campuses. Why do you think he would do that?
I'm not sure. I mean,
you think of any good reason to do that?
I'm not sure. I think it's worthy of pursuit in terms of investigation and hearings simply because we know that Confucius Institutes operate as outposts for China's United Front Work Department, which plays a key role in its political warfare. There are numerous examples of Confucius Institutes and their follow-on successors, sometimes referred to as Confucius classrooms, being harnessed to intimidate Asian American students studying here in the United States, to control curricula that are used and propagated on U.S. college campuses, and to control research initiatives that are developed as a result of these funds. So I think that while the number of Confucius Institutes has dropped precipitously from 113 to about 10 today, The problem is that we've seen this proliferation of Confucius Institute-like agreements. And frankly, no one has been able to sort of understand the scale and scope of that problem because there's no information.
Mr. Singleton, my time's run out. I'm getting tapped out here, so thank you for your time. Appreciate you being here today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our ranking member as well, and to the witnesses. Thank you for your testimony. And Mr. Singleton, as I was listening to you talk about the endowments, et cetera, I'm not going to ask you a question, but if there's data available, I would sure like to get copies of it. But let me just begin. When establishing foreign influence compliance protocols, institutions of higher education have to balance compliance and create a welcoming campus climate. I am a retired 40-year college professor, so I do have an interest in that. But I am pleased to see how many institutions take this dual responsibility seriously. Florida International University, for example, established a university-wide task force on foreign influence and global risk. Mr. Yang, can you discuss briefly the value of incorporating community stakeholders when developing policies around foreign influence and international research collaboration?
Thank you for that question. It is absolutely vital for the community to be involved. Right now, what we are seeing is the community is scared to speak up about issues such as this because they feel like they are being targeted, whether it is scientists in the university space, whether it is students that are thinking about applying to universities here in the United States. There is a clear chilling effect that is happening because of this rhetoric that is being used. And I respect what Mr. Singleton is saying, but I must take issue a little bit with the focus again on China. Yes, there are issues with respect to transparency, but if we are focusing just on what the Chinese government is doing, what the Xi Jinping government is doing, then we are missing the forest for the trees. Yes, we should be talking about transparency, we should talk about accountability, but it should be accountability for all different countries, all different foreign influence.
Okay, thank you, sir. So can you discuss best practices for engaging with international academics in a way that maintains relationships and protects international scholars from racial discrimination?
Thank you for that. Part of this is setting clear standards, and I see with respect to NSPM 33, which was promulgated by the OSTP, trying to standardize guidance with respect to research grants, what is necessary to be reported. I agree with Mr. Moore that Section 117 could be a very useful vehicle to make sure that we have standard forms that should be used. One thing I would want to be careful about is the enforcement mechanism, whether investigators are trained on how to investigate these issues, and what the enforcement actually is. Too often we have seen Asian American scientists have basically paperwork errors turn into criminal prosecutions when these should be handled as an administrative matter.
Yes, sir. So we know that maintaining academic openness and collaboration in academia allows us to engage with bright individuals from all over the world, and if there are threats against international academics, it prevents amazing talents from working with our universities. So let me ask you, Mr. Yang, in what ways has the Asian Americans Advancing Justice worked to combat issues of racial discrimination?
Well, on combating racial discrimination as a whole, it is really an all-of effort. First is making sure that we are teaching history in our schoolrooms on Asian American history, and making sure that all of the different communities are represented, whether they're African American, Latino American, LGBTQ Americans. Part of this is making sure that everyone is comfortable telling their own stories. Part of this is making sure that scientists and researchers and students are comfortable talking to law enforcement, feeling like even if they make an administrative error, like Sherry Chen did in saying that she had a contact with a Chinese person in 2011 rather than 2012, that doesn't become criminalized behavior. Making sure that we are specific about how we are engaging with the community, consistent engagement, not only from the law enforcement end, but from the get-go in terms of creating these standards that we're talking about.
Thank you, sir. You mentioned in your testimony that MIT, Yale University, Stanford, for example, and at least 8 other institutions have issued statements detailing their concerns with the targeting of Chinese scientists and academics. So can you just explain briefly, I just have about 20 seconds, on the investigations against people of Asian descent and how they may affect the number of academics that engage with our universities?
For those universities, some of them are afraid of hiring them, and some of them are afraid of engaging with them and collaborating with them because they fear that they're going to have additional burdens imposed upon them or have their behavior be criminalized.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm right on time. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Thompson from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing, and thanks to all of our witnesses for your testimony. Your research and innovation in American universities is clearly the envy of the rest of the world, and for good reason. From developing groundbreaking treatments for cancer to advancements in precision agriculture that help feed the world, American institutions of higher education are truly on the cutting edge. As the old saying goes, however, with great power comes great responsibility. With foreign adversaries like China and Russia increasingly falling behind in certain sectors, they're looking to steal American research and innovation to help make up those losses. It's imperative upon all of us to ensure that does not happen. Mr. Moore, in your testimony, you noted the extensive issues the Department of Education has had in processing, investigating, and enforcing Section 117 reporting requirements. There's an awful lot of data coming into the department under these requirements, and especially given your experience as Chief Investigative Counsel at the department, do you think the department has the capacity to properly process all of this incoming information?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that's a very good question. First, I want to say there are some career folks at the Department of Education and the Office of General Counsel, particularly, that do a superb job, and America could be proud of them. Having said that, most of the Department of Education is not suited to review financial records coming in from departments or to engage in the necessary vetting of collaborations or to advise other federal agencies on those fronts. I think that it may be something, particularly if the department can't show that it's serious about enforcing Section 117, that Congress may want to look at whether or not enforcement of these disclosures needs to go to an agency that's actually got America's national security interest as one of its tasks and also has the competency to study financial relationships between universities in the documents that they report and our other countries and entities acting on behalf of other countries.
Thank you for that. Also in your testimony, you noted that the department should immediately return enforcement obligations to the Office of General Counsel. How do you believe that that would improve enforcement and processing capabilities?
In a word, the Office of the General Counsel is full of attorneys, and so universities take that a little bit more seriously because they have huge staffs. I mean, Harvard, the other universities that we investigated have massive staffs full of very able counsel, and so at a minimum to have moved enforcement to the federal student aid where they don't have attorneys. They're not suited for that. They aren't armed to do battle with counsel for a big university or the law firms that the big university retains. It's just universities have no reason to take it seriously when they're facing federal student aid instead of at least the Office of the General Counsel.
And given the current challenges, Mr. Moore, do you think expanding reporting requirements would yield any different results than the current requirements, or are there other ways we can target the kinds of malicious activities that our adversaries are engaging in, and would it be more effective to limit new actions to just countries of concern?
Thank you, Congressman. I think there should be heightened concern about the countries that have all but declared war against the United States. The CCP certainly is one of them. And I think that simply enforcing what's currently on the books, particularly with regard to prohibiting anonymizing of donors, is critically important, because then we can at least know who made that $14.8 million contribution in May of 2018 to UPenn from China. Who was that? And do they have an interest in the People's Liberation Army or other CCP entities that are very unfriendly to the United States? So, I mean, I think Right now, it's very important to enforce Section 117 as it is and tighten it up. The department could tighten it up tomorrow and say no anonymizing of donors, and they could do that in a heartbeat if they chose. And I hope that Congress can act at least on that.
Well, thank you. I look forward to working with all of you to ensure we protect American innovation and keep our competitive edge on the global stage. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Yang, in the 1950s, Congress participated in a shameful episode known as the Second Red Scare, when fear of foreign communists infiltrating our society and our government resulted in many unfounded accusations and prosecutions, led in part by Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy, that led to the ruin of countless American lives. That is a part of our history that kept coming to my mind last night as I was reading the briefing materials for today's hearings. And as we know, we have a long history in this country of anti-Asian discrimination, which was exacerbated by the way our former president talked about the COVID pandemic and much of the China bashing that was normalized by his colleagues and resulted in horrifying attacks on Asian Americans, including our highly valued colleague, Congresswoman Judy Chu. So, Mr. Yang, how can we address real risks to our intellectual capital and our national security without allowing anti-Asian discrimination that should be anathema to all Americans and is contrary to the fundamental foundations of our democracy?
Thank you very much for that question. Narrative is key in the first instance. Once we engage in overblown narrative, that results in bad policies. As one example would be the discriminatory land laws that were passed in Florida recently. Yes, again, we do have national security concerns with the Chinese government, but to result in land laws where Chinese citizens are not allowed to own property in this country, just solely on this baseless fear, is the type of sledgehammer that I am talking about rather than using a scalpel. We should be thinking about what precisely are the policy risks that we are talking about, whether it is with respect to solar energy, whether it is with respect to artificial intelligence, whether it is with respect to semiconductors, and address those policy issues and not just engage in a broader narrative of the Chinese are declaring war against us, the broader narrative of that we are in an existential threat with China. The other thing that strikes me about your analogy to the 1950s that is striking is that even in the 1950s, when we had the Red Scare, average Russian citizens were not generally targeted. Average Asian Americans are being targeted right now. And that is what we are seeing. Whereas during the height of the communist era, we still referred to it as the communist regime. We talked about the Putin regime. Now we just talk about the Chinese, or maybe we talk about the Chinese government or the CCP. Yes, Xi Jinping is an autocrat. We can talk about that, and we can talk about those specific policies. But let's talk about those policies and not a society and not a people.
And Mr. Yang, as we look to the future and increasing economic and potential military competition with China, many experts say that the most important thing we can do is continue to invest in our people, our education, and our ability to innovate, which has long been the envy of the world. And I believe one of our superpowers is our ability to attract the best and the brightest from around the world to come study in the U.S. and oftentimes live and work in the U.S. So what impact do you believe it will have on our country if we fail to attract the best and the brightest from around the world to come study and work in the U.S.?
Thank you for that. It is absolutely correct that there are Asian Americans, not just Chinese Americans, but Asian Americans, and frankly, people from around the country, around the world, that no longer see the United States as the open society that it used to be, that the society that would value that innovation, value having open discussions. And that is what we need to get back to to understand that that is how we become stronger. The fact that I could represent the American government in the Department of Commerce when I am negotiating against Chinese people on the other side and represent our country, that is the strength of our country. That is what makes us special, and we should celebrate that.
Thank you. Let me just mention that I was recently on a congressional trip to Japan, and one of the issues that was raised was the fact that Japanese students are no longer coming here to study in our universities, and that's a loss to our country, but it's also a loss to the strong relationship that's currently so important between the U.S. and Japan. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd just like to also remind my friends on the other side of the aisle that we are talking this hearing about the infiltration of bad actors into our system. $6.5 billion of undisclosed funds is something that American people know about. So wherever that might go, that's what we're trying to find out. That I'd like to introduce or acknowledge Mr. James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Singleton, it is clear that the CCP is aggressively expanding its military presence, but even more so its influence throughout the globe. What's even more concerning is its reach within the United States and on our borders. That's why I introduced the No American Tax Dollars to the CCP Act, which prevents the CCP from profiting off of us, from building their middle class on the backs of ours and building their military on the backs of ours. Unfortunately, higher education seems to be a tougher mountain to climb. Without checks, reasonable checks, checks that apply to the people who are sitting in this room, my colleagues as well, who have to report all of our financial disclosures and cannot accept foreign donations. There are lower standards for those who have the public trust and taxpayer money in our university. Our top universities continue to send hundreds of millions of dollars worth of valuable military and scientific research straight into the CCP's hands. This will only be used to undermine our stature and influence around the world. Now, this should not be conflated or confused with our great need to be that beacon of hope, that light, that shining city on the hill, that destination for innovation and education for those around the world. But at the same time, we cannot be taken advantage of. We have an obligation to protect the American people and our interests at home and abroad. Americans cannot own property in China. So why then is the CCP taking advantage of Americans? Mr. Singleton, your opinion, sir. How does stolen research from our universities negatively affect America's effort internationally?
Sure, absolutely. I would agree with Mr. Yang that targeted and tailored enforcement is essential, but make no mistake, China is the worst offender in terms of intellectual property theft and tech transfer threat in the world. Collaboration between the U.S. and China based on transparency and shared values can be incredibly valuable. But China has not been transparent about its military buildup, and it has harnessed technologies specifically developed by U.S. universities to subjugate and persecute its ethnic minorities. What's more, China's civilian university system plays a major role in China's military-industrial complex, including its nuclear and cyber espionage programs. The CCP has specifically ordered civilian universities and their students to integrate into, quote, the military-civil fusion system and to advance the two-way transfer and transformation of military and civilian technological achievements, end quote. So these types of collaborations simply require enhanced due diligence above and beyond standard practice. And on this front, there's ample opportunity for Congress.
Thank you for that. For my colleagues across the aisle who took great pains to educate all of us and took great offense to all lives matter over the past few years, are failing to give the American people enough credit to recognize that we can nuance the argument between CCP, who are adversaries, and Asian Americans, who are our brothers. In your testimony, you mentioned the need for our programs not funded by the CCP to equip future generations with key international skills like language learning and global expertise. How do you envision these programs? And how can a district like mine, a #1 manufacturing district in the nation, a blue-collar district whose schooling focuses heavily on CTE and STEM, how can we keep pace with some of these expectations?
Absolutely. China has made absolutely and abundantly clear its focus on obtaining cutting-edge information, both through illicit means, but also through routine exchanges in the academic and research space to advance its great power ambitions. The good news, if there is any here, is that there are tremendous opportunities and tremendous resources available to local stakeholders to freely investigate and conduct routine due diligence on their Chinese partners. The best one is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has a Chinese university tracker that's entirely free. It's a free tool that helps universities and researchers understand the links between Chinese universities and China's military. Local FBI offices are also heavily involved in monitoring this threat. Think tanks like mine and other research institutes collaborate with universities on a regular basis to help develop repeatable vetting models that allow them to evaluate whether a research partnership is a true threat or whether it's going to enhance American competitiveness and deepen person-to-person ties.
Thank you. I'm sorry to cut you off. I appreciate that. But in my last few seconds, I want anyone else on this panel to give us a to-do list, homework on how we can help restore America's competitive edge. And this includes continuing to be that destination for Chinese, for Indian, for anyone who wants to come and contribute to America's competitiveness and not advantage our adversaries. I want places like Warren and Sterling Heights and Rochester Hills and my 10th Congressional District in Michigan to help America elevate its game. Thanks a lot. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Ms. Chapel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before turning to my questions, I just want to correct the record regarding statements around allegations of the Penn Biden Center. Republicans have suggested that the current administration is not taking its responsibility seriously to address allegations regarding the Penn Biden Center. The University of Pennsylvania has publicly stated that the center, quote, has never solicited or received any gifts from any Chinese or other foreign entity. The university has never solicited any gifts for the center. And since its inception in 2017, there have been 3 unsolicited gifts from 2 donors, which combine to a total of $1,100. Both donors are American. And I also want to remind my colleagues that the previous administration declined to investigate claims surrounding the Penn Center, stating that an investigation with respect to Section 117 compliance was unwarranted. So I'd like to enter into the record an article from the Daily Pennsylvanian from January of this year outlining these facts.
No objection.
Thank you. I want to start by saying that I'm deeply disturbed by the topic of this hearing. And I say that as one of just a dozen naturalized citizens to serve in the United States Congress and the first South Asian American woman elected to the House. You know, my parents sent me to the United States when I was 16 years old by myself because they believed that this was the country where opportunity was possible that was not possible anywhere else. And they sent me with the belief that America was a welcoming place, a place where I could thrive and reach my highest potential. And I have. But this hearing today, reading the memo, listening to the comments today, talking about people as threats just because they were born in another country is just plain wrong. It's just wrong, and it undercuts our ability to attract the best and the brightest. And frankly, it's hateful rhetoric that is a distraction from meaningfully addressing real national security threats, which we absolutely should do. Just in my district alone, I've got 11,000 international students who contribute $456 million to our economy. And that's just my district. Imagine what the contributions are across the country. And Mr. Yang, I want to thank you for being here today and really for your decades of work to advance the civil rights of Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And I want you to just briefly, because I have a couple of questions for you, but briefly tell us the dangers of the escalating rhetoric about China and the proposed legislative actions in this space, and the history that we've gone through in this country where we've seen over and over again how that rhetoric hurts our Asian American people across the country.
Thank you, and I'll try to be brief. The dangers are real. We've seen murders. Literally, we've seen murders because of anti-Asian sentiment, and that will continue if we continue to have hyperbolic rhetoric. We have seen people that do not want to come to the United States. Part of this is making sure that we embrace, in addition to preventing bad actors from coming in, we got to keep the good actors that want to be here. And that includes so many Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, students that come here for all of the reasons that we've talked about, that want to stay here, are being precluded from staying here because of this anti-Asian sentiment, because of restrictive laws regarding ownership of land or other things.
One piece that I think is really important to talk about is the real value of international students, of researchers and professors, not just to increase campus diversity, which is of course great and wonderful, we support that, but also to the benefits of U.S. foreign policy and to our standing in the world. And you touched on this briefly, but please elaborate a little bit on why it's so important to have this engagement with Chinese students and how it helps us with our diplomatic strategy.
There is so much misunderstanding right now between the United States and China. Again, I recognize that there are geopolitical challenges, but if you talk to the average American and the average Chinese student, whether in China or that are studying here, they find so much in common. And if we are setting up a situation where they are no longer talking to each other, they don't feel welcome here, then our divisions will just get further. Lines will harden even more, and that foreign relations will become even more difficult.
I do believe that there are legitimate security concerns that we have to address with protecting federally funded research. How would a precise response for preventing actual cases of espionage and intellectual property theft better serve our nation? What does that look like?
What it looks like is very specific definitions of what it means to have, for example, government control, what it means to have foreign influence. What it means is very understandable terms that universities and administrators can administer. What it means is making sure we have investigators that are trained to avoid bias, avoid stereotypes. And what it means also is to make sure that universities feel like if they make an innocent mistake, they will not get criminalized for that behavior.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Demonizing communities for their country of origin breeds hate and discrimination. I hope we stop doing it. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad my colleague brought up the Penn Biden Center because I want to ask some more questions about it. When President Biden opened the Penn Biden Center think tank at the University of Pennsylvania in 2017, Chinese gifts to UPenn spiked. Chinese donors gave $105 million from mid-2018 to mid-2022, which is nearly double the known previous donations. The current Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, served as the center's director. Many of its former employees now work in the White House. And then Vice President Biden illegally stored classified documents in his office at the center. Mr. Moore, was the Department of Education aware of the spike in Chinese donations to UPenn after the Penn Biden Center opened?
Thank you, Congressman. If I could begin by saying the reason that we knew about the money to UPenn, the spike in that and the foreign contributions to UPenn, was because of the reporting portal that we had created under Secretary DeVos. And we were also aware of the same pattern at many other universities, but it was particularly startling to see with UPenn what they had received. That was very notable. Unfortunately, under Section 117, we once that information had been reported, we really couldn't do anything with it, and that's why we didn't. That's why I wrote that we weren't going to open an investigation. It was not warranted, but that information should be public. The donors should not have been anonymized.
But you did look into opening an investigation, but Section 117 didn't give you the authority to do so. Is that what you're explaining?
Congressman, there were a number of public interest groups who accessed the information on the portal that the public can access and Congress can access, who became aware of that information that was being provided by UPenn. Some of them wrote to us, and I think members of Congress wrote to us, urging us to open an investigation. It would have been a very political thing, inappropriate, frankly, for the Office of the General Counsel if, after UPenn had reported in compliance with Section 117, which is a very bare reporting requirement, if we had then opened an investigation into UPenn, frankly, that would have been an act we shouldn't have engaged in, and so we didn't.
But you do admit that you did find it abnormal. The
Absolutely.
sheer amount of Chinese donations to the Penn Biden Center wasn't normal.
It was extraordinary.
What did you make of it?
I can only speculate, but our job, frankly, the Department of Education, was to ensure that policymakers, congressmen and women, and the American people could see for themselves all that money going to UPenn from China and other universities to access our technology and perhaps to influence future policymakers.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about well over $100 million just to this one think tank center that obviously had deep connections to the Biden family and now to the Biden administration. I mean, you talk about you can only speculate, but what would the Chinese donors get out of that type of access?
I think that's a very fair question, Congressman. If I might also point out, it is, I think the Biden Center has stated, or that UPenn has stated repeatedly, that that they never solicited funds anywhere for the Biden Center. And instead, those funds came in, their solicitations, and they actually had international fundraising operations, a tour by current ambassador to Germany, Gutmann, to collect contributions, foreign contributions. But all those funds went into the general operating fund for UPenn. They didn't go to Biden Center. And so they were certain those funds were commingled and certainly went to the general operations and may have gone to the Biden Center. And that's something that I think is worthy of
I only got a minute left, but you were aware of it. You admit that it was abnormal. You said that Chinese donations were flowing to other universities too. They were reported because of the strict Trump administration guidelines. But can you think of anything else, any other think tank or university that received a comparable amount of Chinese donations to the Penn Biden Center?
Not in that time frame. Absolutely not. I'm unaware of them. The public could investigate on the portal to see if it occurred. I'm not aware of it occurring.
Really, it's wild. I mean, you couldn't make it up. Now he's the president. Blinken is the Secretary of State, and they had these deep relationships. As you transitioned and prepared for the transition to the Biden administration, did you keep files, documents, turn it over to them in hopes that they would do something about it?
I worked daily with the career people in the department and certainly didn't destroy anything. Our response was made public, so we didn't make any recommendations beyond what we made at the time that are public.
Really crazy. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mrs. Saplan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. As we saw during the previous administration, carelessness and wrongful targeting when discussing global perspectives in higher education can have a chilling effect on academic freedom. At best, it limits the ability of faculty members from other countries to advance groundbreaking research in their fields, and at worst, it leads to unjust investigations and surveillance and prosecution of individuals. Callous and xenophobic rhetoric, particularly when it fails to distinguish between Chinese or other AAPI immigrants and the CCP, has also led to a rise in hate crimes and intolerance toward Asian Americans and Asian immigrants. And I've seen that in the district I represent in Northwest Oregon. We have a lot of international companies and a lot of people there from around the world, and I have seen it firsthand in the district I represent. So many college campuses today include students, faculty, and scholars who represent a diversity of backgrounds, perspectives, and life experiences. Portland State University, for example, in the district I represent, is a testament to the power of valuing global perspectives and representation in American colleges. PSU enrolls more than 2,000 international students from 63 countries, provides them with support, advising, and career opportunities. In Oregon, a couple of years ago, in the district I represent, international students brought almost $41 million, and that was 1,555 students in the first congressional district. University of Oregon, my alma mater, has close to 1,300. Oregon State has more than 2,800 international students. So at Portland State, again, they established a groundbreaking 3-year partnership with Seoul Welfare Foundation in South Korea. And they allowed PSU Masters of Social Work and PhD students to study Seoul's programs and delivery systems. And by forging those fruitful partnerships, this can benefit Oregonians and Americans. And by supporting the well-being and academic achievement of international students, Portland State is leading the way in demonstrating how higher education broadly can be a global enterprise. So, Mr. Yang, I have a 2-part question. What is the benefit to students, colleges, and the country to incorporate those global perspectives into college campuses, and how can we continue to uplift the importance of international engagements in higher education?
No, thank you very much for that question. Certainly, the cultural exchanges are absolutely vital if we want to avoid thinking in a zero-sum manner about the United States and China relations in particular. One thing that troubles me also is we are asking university officials oftentimes, tasking them to be the watchdogs for espionage or intellectual property theft, where they don't have the proper tools to do it. And what happens in these situations is they overcorrect. So even student organizations encounter frustrations in hosting events because there is a concern that that might be seen as a propaganda tool for the Chinese government. So we need to continue to foster those exchanges. We need to continue to recognize that there is a common humanity in all of this, and that if we continue to have exchanges between Chinese students and American students, I think the American ideals will clearly win in the end, such that the Chinese students, as we have demonstrated throughout history, will want to come to the United States, learn from the United States, and stay in the United States and contribute to our economy.
Right, which I think is a reminder that we desperately need some good comprehensive immigration reform, because too often people come here and study, earn advanced degrees, and then end up having to go back and oftentimes work for competing companies. So I just want to put that word out there. It's not within this committee's jurisdiction, but it's a critical issue. So I also want to discuss the Biden administration's approach to enforcing the gift reporting requirements for colleges and universities under Section 117 of the Higher Education Act. The Department of Education under this administration has made it easier for universities to report gifts of more than $250,000 as required under the law. They've streamlined the reporting process through the Office of Federal Student Aid in conjunction with the department's Office of General Counsel. So, Mr. Yang, why is it important for universities to be transparent about potential undue foreign influence? And of course, we want to find the right balance, but be aware of and crack down on security concerns. And how can the Department of Education strike the right balance to promote oversight and reporting without increasing institutional burden?
Yeah, transparency is key, and I agree with all of my fellow panelists there. And part of that is simplicity, making sure that universities that are tasked with so many different responsibilities are able to understand those. Part of it is making sure that if they do make an honest mistake, that they will not be criminalized for that. And part of this is ensuring that part of this process is that they will be able to work actually with our government officials and foster some of these exchanges. I think if we do all of that right, then again, whether it is with respect to research, whether it is respect to education, cultural exchanges, I believe that our ideals will win.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, as I yield back, I want to note that as a representative of the Pacific Northwest, we saw firsthand the horrific effects of the Japanese internment. That's an awful part of this country's history. We need to tread very carefully in this area. I agree with my colleague, Congresswoman Jayapal, that the title of this hearing is unnecessarily inflammatory. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Ms. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panelists here today for your information and your testimony. It's extremely important. I was concerned when I read through the briefing papers and began to prepare for this hearing when I read through some of the examples of the censorship, direct and indirect, that the Chinese Communist Party is having in our colleges and universities today. Censorship in the form of direct censorship, where materials and discussions and research topics are being curtailed because folks are afraid, frankly, of the Chinese government. And then self-censorship from students that are here from China, and some China-focused scholars that have expressed that they are refraining from making certain comments or participating in events or engaging in debates that were critical of the Chinese government because they were afraid of retaliation. And then third, surveillance, that there's examples of on-campus discussions or activities where the Chinese authorities have surveilled those activities and come down hard on those students that have participated in them. And then fourth, harassments and threats. Scholars, particularly ones from China, but also students, have described being threatened by the Chinese government officials or others who seek to silence criticism towards the Chinese government. This is all very concerning to me. Aside from the Confucius Institutes that we've talked about today, and aside from the money that's flowing into colleges and universities that's not being reported back, it's significant. Mr. Singleton, I'd just like to give you the first opportunity to talk about this and tell me, do these heavy-handed tactics by the CCP to chill free speech and freedom of association concern you?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've spent a tremendous amount of the conversation today talking about harmful rhetoric from American audiences, and I wholeheartedly agree with Mr. Yang's comments on that front. But we do so at the detriment of talking about the Chinese Communist Party's direct role and access on U.S. college campuses. Chinese Students and Scholars Associations are a vignette of what we see across the United States. These are united front directed and funded organizations that operate at more than 150 college campuses. They have been directly implicated in the harassment and intimidation of university administrators, but also Chinese students studying here in the United States if and when they express political views that diverge from the preferred political narratives of the Chinese Communist Party. They've been involved in the suppression of free speech, the disruption of events involving the Uyghur genocide in particular, and they are wholly unregulated. These are organizations that receive, as I mentioned, funding and direction from the Chinese Communist Party. They report to Chinese consulates and the Chinese embassy here in Washington, D.C., and yet they are wholly unregulated with unfettered access to U.S. college campuses.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm really careful. I do my best to use the language Chinese Communist Party instead of talking about a nationality or an ethnicity because I recognize some of the issues that are presented when we don't do that correctly. And I firmly believe that every person in this world was created by God with equal and eternal value, regardless of where they were created. So I'm really careful about that. But I am concerned about the Chinese Communist Party's influence in our colleges and universities, and not just what we brought up so far, but looking back at how they've influenced the Chinese Students and Scholars Association. Mr. Yang, I want to turn to you and get some opinion about this from you. In 2017, the CSSA at the University of California, San Diego protested against an invitation to the Dalai Lama to give that year's commencement address, and they said that they consulted with the Chinese consulate. In 2019, about that issue. In 2019, Columbia University canceled a planned panel on Chinese human rights violations due to pressures from a, quote, Chinese student group. Similar protests occurred in 2021 at the University of Chicago against a campus event with Hong Kong activist Nathan Law. These all seem to go back to the Chinese Communist Party, where the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, at least on some of these campuses, were interfacing and interacting with the Chinese Communist Party to understand who they should protest and who they shouldn't. What's your reaction to that? Is that
thank you for that question. I agree that we should be looking at specific issues, and there may be specific associations that are problematic. Where I have a concern is if we paint with a broad brush that all student associations or scholars associations are problematic. The other thing that I would agree with you on is that we need to take a different law enforcement approach. Chinese students and professors right now feel caught between a rock and a hard place. They feel like on one hand that the Americans feel like they're not American enough, and on the other hand, the Chinese Communist Party is targeting them. So we in our American community should be embracing many of them and understand that we should be helping to protect them, to protect their rights here on campus or at their homes.
Well, let me just be clear about my concern. It's not about Chinese people. It is about the Chinese Communist Party. That is where my concern lies. It's about the decisions made by a totalitarian regime to try to influence free speech and free association in this country. I thank you for your time.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Ms. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before turning to my questions, I want to first address concerns around Section 117 compliance being housed in the Office of Federal Student Aid. There have been comments made to argue that the Department's Education Department's move of Section 117 compliance back to the Office of Federal Student Aid is a poor decision, when in fact the Office of General Counsel, where it was, is in no way equipped to evaluate financial statements and provide resources in the same manner as FSA is. Unfortunately, we continue to block enhanced transparency and implementation of Section 117 by failing to increase funding for FSA. So I just wanted to make that point. Mr. Moore, exactly, can you just for the record explain how compliance with Section 117 enhances our national security?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that it enhances national security by providing full disclosure of information about possible foreign influences at universities, particularly universities with significant research institutions on campus. where STEM technology is funded by the taxpayers. And I think having a knowledge about the relationships between foreign donors, especially from some countries that don't wish us well, is extremely important for you as members of Congress and for the American people.
And Mr. Singleton, does Section 117 compliance affect investment decisions made by university endowments?
No, it does not.
Thank you. Mr. Yang, the conversation about foreign influence in higher education can often lead to over-sensibilization and an irrational fear of foreign nationals. The title of this hearing is somewhat problematic in that it seeks to instill fear into our minds. Can you say a word about how this kind of rhetoric can lead to the rise in incidents of bias, violence, and discrimination against Asian American students and scholars?
Thank you very much for that question. Certainly, whenever we talk about foreign influence, it is an appropriate topic to talk about. But then when we start talking about whether it is the Chinese as a whole, even talking about it just in terms of the CCP, it can lead to overgeneralizations. One of the other analogies that I had, I referred to the Cold War earlier, was certainly during the Cold War, and even now, we always refer to the Putin regime. We always refer to sort of the authoritarianism in Russia. And during World War II, we always refer to as Hitler's Germany or Nazi Germany. But when it comes to Asia, we do not have that same nuance. You know, during World War II, we referred to it at best as the Japanese. No one knew who Hirohito was. Here now, we should be more specific. If we are concerned about the autocratic regime in China, name the autocratic regime, whether it's Xi Jinping and his policies or the like. If we start to get to that level of nuance, that level of specificity, then we start to reduce the likelihood of violence, repercussions, quote-unquote collateral damage against the Asian American community.
Thank you. And can you remind us of the comments made by AAJC on the affirmative action cases recently decided by the Supreme Court?
By who, sorry?
The comments made by AAJC.
Sure.
On the affirmative action cases.
So with respect to affirmative action, this is, again, recognizing that our community is very diverse. We have been supportive of affirmative action. We think it's important for the narrative of America to make sure that we understand that America includes all of our different communities, whether they're Asian Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans. And too often, our community has been used as a wedge to drive, again, that narrative of we are somehow a model minority that is set apart from other communities. So it's important to recognize that race still matters in this country. One message that I have for college students in talking about universities is that they should still be talking about race, their upbringing in their college essays. That is something that was explicitly allowed by Chief Justice Roberts. And our university's officials need to recognize that diversity plays a critical role in our education system. And that diversity will only strengthen our education system.
And can you say a word about diversity within the Asian community?
The Asian American community is exceptionally diverse. And sometimes you think of people like me, an East Asian, Chinese American male. But obviously it includes Filipino Americans, Vietnamese Americans, South Asian Americans, Indian Americans, Pakistani Americans. And we need to recognize that diversity. So when we talk about affirmative action benefits many of those communities that otherwise would not have a chance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Moore, the current administration has given no indication that any existing Section 117 investigations are being continued. In fact, in August 2022, the American Council on Education wrote a thank you letter to the Department of Education for its, quote, plans to close, end quote, all investigations. Why is it crucial for the department to follow through with these investigations instead of quietly closing them based on requests from post-secondary education stakeholders?
Thank you, Chairwoman. I think it's very important that closure of any investigation be fact-based. I was rather shocked to see the Vice President of ACE announce last August in that thank you letter that he had been told by department officials that every investigation was going to be closed and that responsibility for Section 117 investigations would be transferred to FSA. And if the department actually closes them, all the investigations in kind of one fell swoop without doing it in a fact-based way, I don't understand that. It seems like merit has been tossed out the window other than let's get rid of these.
Thank you. Mr. Moore, the Biden administration nearly finished its plan to transfer enforcement of Section 117 away from the Office of General Counsel and into the Office of Federal Student Aid, FSA. Given FSA's skill set and current workload to implement the president's illegal student loan cancellation schemes, is FSA well equipped to handle Section 117 enforcement?
Congresswoman, I don't believe that they're equipped at all to handle Section 117 enforcement, especially with the, if everything was running smoothly with Section 117 and there wasn't a history going back many years of massive violations and lack of compliance, then, you know, maybe it would be something to say, okay, this can go on autopilot to a less aggressive component of the department. That's not the case. And so it's an extremely strange time to more or less downgrade the investigative potential that the department has when they're looking at these investigations. So it doesn't make any sense at all.
Thank you. Mr. Singleton, you mentioned the state of Florida passing bipartisan unanimous legislation to protect Florida universities. I also understand many Florida universities publicly supported that bill. Can you elaborate on how this coalition formed to promote common sense foreign influence reforms?
Absolutely, and yes, it did pass unanimously in both the Florida House and Florida Senate before being signed into law by the Florida governor. It really was a whole-of-society approach. There was collaborative debate between universities, administrators, investigators from the Florida Board of Governors. And what the law does is it prohibits state universities, their employees, and representatives from soliciting or accepting grants from entities located in China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, and I believe Cuba. And it also mandates that state universities obtain approval from the Board of Governors before entering into contracts or partnerships with entities located in these countries of concern. They have to demonstrate that there is value to students and that the agreements don't pose risks to the research enterprise. And the third part is that the state Board of Governors is now authorized to withhold performance funding for any university or college that has not met these requirements or elects to enter into an authorized agreement, an unauthorized agreement or partnership with a country of concern. And so there's both a carrot and stick approach. But at the end of the day, university administrators, community stakeholders, and members of the Florida legislature all came together, passed this unanimously.
I'm glad to know that there are such enlightened people in the colleges and universities there in Florida, and that they saw the wisdom in coming together in this. I think protecting our students and national security should be a bipartisan issue. It should be something that all our citizens care about. And I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to join Republicans in these efforts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you. We'll go for Mr. Singleton here. In your testimony, you talked that the goals of things like the Communist Party would be to invest in American universities to A, stifle free speech, which is something we've kind of seen in this administration, and otherwise monitor activities or propagate disinformation and false narratives. Could you please elaborate on that and tell us what type of disinformation and false narratives people might want to propagate?
Sure. The Chinese Communist Party is waging what it calls a discourse war against the United States.
Could you speak up?
Sure. The Chinese Communist Party is waging its discourse power against the United States and other allied democracies around the world. It seeks to set...
We're not a democracy, but go ahead.
Yeah, to seek and to set and shape global narratives about China's rise in ways by comparing, contrasting, and consistently misrepresenting the benefits of authoritarianism and the deficiencies, so-called, of democracy. And so on U.S. college campuses, one of the things that they do is sow social division on college campuses. The Chinese Students and Scholars Associations that we've mentioned are specifically funded to protest, disrupt free speech protections, academic integrity, all with the goal of presenting a particular political narrative around China's so-called peaceful rise.
Maybe I didn't hear you. I want you to specifically tell us what type of narratives, and by the way, when the Soviet Union was still around, there was a KGB agent who left, and he felt that most of the money being spent by the KGB in the United States was not doing spying. It was, in essence, to spread disinformation in America to cause America to collapse from within. Could you give us examples, specific examples of false narratives that representatives of the CCP might try to promote in American universities?
Sure, absolutely. The first and foremost is that the United States is in decline, that the Chinese Communist Party does not represent a risk to U.S. national security or to the world order. They also propagate malign narratives about Chinese human rights abuses, seeking to neutralize the legitimate claims made about genocide and Chinese Communist Party directed genocide activities against the Uyghurs. This is all designed in many respects, like I said, to sow social division here, but to help propagate false Chinese Communist Party narratives across the United States and to undermine our
Could you give me those false narratives about the United States? What do they want our students to think about the U.S.?
Sure, they tend to want us to believe that the U.S. is a declining power and that we should embrace the narratives and the lack of universal values that the Chinese Communist Party propagates in the development of a new international order that reflects China's values and interests, that rejects human rights, that rejects universal values, and that seeks to, in many ways, divide the United States population against each other.
How would you divide the U.S.? How are we trying to divide the U.S. population?
Well, the Chinese call it cognitive domain warfare, and it's not, the United States is certainly not the only target of the Chinese Communist Party's activities. We see them quite actively in places like Taiwan, where they're seeking to divide the population against itself, but also convince
Give me an example of how they're trying to divide Americans against themselves.
Sure. I mean, simply propagating narratives that the U.S. government is anti-Asian or seeking to perhaps put, I think it's sort of been referenced here, Chinese Americans.
You mean they're trying to say the Americans are anti-Asian?
They say the U.S. government is going against Chinese citizens, Chinese diaspora communities. In fact, the new Chinese ambassador here to Washington, D.C., the first message that he sent out upon arriving in Washington, D.C. was a communique to all Chinese students across the United States saying the party is here to protect you.
I mean, to me, people who've come here to Asia, and this is wonderful, I have wonderful Asian friends, they're doing better than any other ethnic group in America. People from India, people from China, people from Philippines. Who in the world what possible narrative would they spread that would tell Asian students that America's anti-Asian? It seems just almost beyond belief you'd even find something like that.
There are no doubt many instances in which there has been, quantifiable rise in anti-Asian rhetoric or attacks on, totally unacceptable attacks on Chinese students. And what the Chinese state media and Chinese state actors do is they amplify those messages in that dialogue in their discourse, seeking to portray the United States as a racist country.
Okay, any specific groups that you can think of that they may be funding or be behind that might spread this divisive narrative?
The Chinese Students and Scholars Association is by far one of the most important.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like now to recognize Ms. Wilson for her closing remarks.
Again, I want to thank the witnesses for their testimonies in today's hearing. We all agree that keeping America at the forefront of innovation and progress requires transparency in our academic and research ecosystems. I'm glad to see the current administration amplifying compliance and returning oversight responsibility to the Federal Student Aid Office. FSA professionals are very experienced in this arena, consistently gathering data from the roughly 6,000 institutions that take part in student financial aid programs. This move has facilitated the reporting of, on average, over 3,000 transactions and 1.5 billion more per year under the administration compared to the previous administrations. Lastly, our effort to promote transparency and accountability should never be subject to politics or partisanship. Instead, we should focus on building sustainable institutionalized oversight. We can and should strike a balance between ensuring compliance and keeping campuses safe for our students, our scholars, and our faculty. And I yield back.
Thank you so much. I'll just wrap up by saying I was very blessed to have been raised around the academic arena. My dad was a college professor for 40 years at Florida A&M, World War II vet. So it was interesting during that time when my community was taught certain things that really helped to be successful. We talked about faith, family, free market, and education. This community, because we believed in that, because we believed education was our gateway, we were hopeful, we were faithful, and we were tenacious enough to succeed. That community that I grew up in the 50s and 60s led the country to growth of the middle class, men matriculated from college, men committed to marriage, and percentage of entrepreneurs. That's the American way. We were also taught about the evil of communism. We were not going to conflate an ideology with a race of people like we're doing today. We understood that the ideology was the most harmful for those who had to live under their oppression. Probably the people who are in the worst shape in our world today are people living in communist China because of the ideology of misery that they have to live in for their freedoms to be taken away from them. I'm excited about the fact that we now are having these kind of conversations. For way too long, we've sat back and talked fluff talk, thinking in some kind of way we can convert communist, evil, Marxism to our way of thinking. We need to understand this is our enemy. We need to understand the reason why we're now in our colleges today that we don't have the same concerns because we now have communists and Marxists impacting our colleges' curriculum. $6.5 billion of funds not being acknowledged says a whole lot about what type of influence they're having on our country today. I'm proud of states like Florida and Utah. In the state of Utah, we have a bill called HB 346, which prohibits higher education institutions from seeking or accepting funding support from restricted foreign entities. That's shut down in Utah, the Confucius Institute. We also have a bill that prohibits all elementary and secondary schools in Utah from seeking or accepting funds from restricted foreign entities. It means they can no longer have the impact on Utah schools that they're having across our country. So I want to thank, again, the witnesses today for this very educational conversation. We need to keep this up. We need to understand that we are truly in a war against an ideology, not people, an ideology that hates our country, that hates our American way, and all we do is look around and see the impact of young people coming out of college with debt and still hating our nation because we have an ideology that's been taught to them as our way. So I'm excited about what we're going to be doing as a conference here, and just know for those institutions out there, the 70% is not being upfront and transparent. We have a conference in place now that's going to hold you accountable. We expect you to, when you take your funds, to let us know where it is, be disclosure, full disclosure, so the American people know where their textiles are going. So thank you so much for your participation, for your expertise. And with that being said, I'd like to thank the witnesses, and without objection, with no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you so much.